Well, hello everybody. My name's John Johnson and I'm joined by my colleague Maxine Fritz from NSF Health Sciences. You've got a double bill today where we're going to go through a really important subject that has really been asked of us constantly over the last year or so. And that is, in the post-COVID world, how will the world be different? How will we have to interact with our clients, our colleagues, and our international regulators, particularly once we start to get back face-to-face and we start to have face-to-face inspections of our manufacturing facilities again? So Maxine and I are going to talk through how you should prepare for that next inspection, some hot tips on how to be sure that your team, your facility, and your quality system is at the right standard for that next inspection. And I'm also going to talk through some of the really difficult questions that you may have, in that, of course, during these really difficult times, you've had to make some compromises. You've had to maybe go against some commitments that you'd previously made. And some of those conversations can be quite difficult. So how do you prepare for those conversations? How do you make sure that you can present things professionally to both your clients and your regulators? So Maxine and I are going to combine our experience in this area and talk through some key tips that should be really useful to you. So we're really looking at the future here. We're looking at how we're going to make a new future after this tremendously disruptive period, and continue to supply our products, our medical products, to a global client base. So we're going to talk through really how those events of the last couple of years have altered our priorities as quality professionals, as operational professionals, and as leaders within the industry, so that ultimately you can run your facility and prepare and execute your next GMP regulatory inspection with confidence. We're going to talk about how you could modify your approach to site preparedness. We're going to talk through some hot topics that we know from speaking to our clients and speaking to regulators are going to be really important the next time you're face-to-face with your regulator. I'm going to talk through a model approach to tackling difficult questions that lie ahead, and being able to present a coherent and professional approach to how you've resolved problems in the past. And we're going to also talk through some best practice on how to respond to either a need for CAPA or respond to a GMP regulatory inspection with some form of GMP remediation plan, whether that's under the review and eyesight of your clients, or whether it's internal, or indeed whether it's following your next GMP regulatory inspection. And then finally, we're going to finish this webinar with a very interesting case study from Maxine. So let's get into this. I think most of you know me by now, and Maxine too, actually. We've been doing these webinars for some years now, and we really want to try and combine our experience on both sides of the pond on how to prepare for the life ahead, for the GMP inspections ahead, and for your key priorities that lie ahead. And you can see my kind of experience that I bring to this webinar as an EU qualified person since '95, and in various senior operational and corporate quality positions. And most of the work I do these days is around business transformational projects. It's about getting sites ready for inspections, or responding to inspections, or preparing for a new paradigm ahead. So moving on to Maxine. Maxine, would you like to say a few words, please?
Yes, I do, John. Thank you. So my name is Maxine Fritz, and I work for NSF. I've been in the consulting space for over 25 years now, and I've also worked for the Food and Drug Administration as well as industry. My area of expertise really is regulatory strategy and compliance. I work on quite a few remediation projects, helping companies come into compliance or continuously improve. We work on many FDA readiness projects, as well as batch record review, certifications, investigations, and those activities, all relating to the quality and regulatory space within the pharma biotech area.
Thanks, Maxine. So let's just have a look at what's been happening over the last couple of years. I mean, we've all seen the tremendously disruptive effects of COVID-19 and various government policies in trying to combat this. And it's affected the industry really profoundly, isn't it? I mean, certainly, on the one hand, there's some firms that are really thriving. They're busy. They're building facilities. They're introducing new products. They're feverishly recruiting new staff, and they're bringing in new competencies into their organizations. But conversely, there are some firms that have been hit really hard here. We're seeing that there are far more supply chain interruptions caused by the combined effects of the pandemic. We're seeing drug shortages. Both Maxine and I have written white papers and webinars on this subject very recently. And it remains one of the FDA and EMA top priorities, where urgent medical needs are not always being met because of drug shortages. We're also hearing from our clients, particularly over the last 2 years, that they're really struggling to fill key vacancies. And this means that staff availability isn't always as it was or as it should be. And that leads to risk-based decision-making. Now, that's a euphemism. Risk-based decision-making can sometimes mean that you're making decisions based on incomplete data, perhaps with information that is not easily interpreted, or indeed with people and teams that have not yet had this type of experience in their careers. So you find that the risk level comes up whenever you have staff availability issues where experienced staff are not available to come along to those meetings, those sessions, and those problem-solving issues. We're also seeing, of course, over the last couple of years, really in terms of dry powder, in terms of capital investment, in terms of building new facilities or resolving GMP deficiency issues that are appearing in facilities, utilities and equipment, that money simply hasn't been spent. Partly because the money is not there, partly because of the interruptions in supply chain, and partly because of the huge uncertainty within many businesses around the world. We're also seeing as well that training programs not always fulfilled over the last couple of years. People have not necessarily been developed and been given the kind of growth opportunities that they need in order to fulfill their roles or their promotions or their career development. So this is leading into quite a difficult time for everybody, because ultimately a lot of the continuous improvement and change programs that you would expect to see over the last 2 or 3 years have either been suspended, postponed, or indefinitely cancelled. So we're expecting to see a number of companies struggle to demonstrate their ongoing cGMP compliance, to be able to provide documented evidence of perpetual compliance to the GMPs is going to be particularly difficult for many companies on the back of what's occurred over the last few years. So how has this actually affected some of these firms? Well, ultimately, legacy facilities are now 2 years older, 2 or 3 years older without being upgraded. We know there's many firms that were looking to upgrade their facilities in line with new regulations. For example, Udrelex Volume 4 Annex 1 concerning sterile products is going to have some new and re-emphasized requirements for product and people isolation. It's going to require a different type of layout for some types of clean rooms. And over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been very little progress in making sure those legacy facilities have been upgraded on time over that period. So we're anticipating that some legacy facilities have not been upgraded as they should be. We're also beginning to see from review of clients' management review systems and their key performance indicators that schedule adherence has also been pretty difficult. You know, when you have so many people off on furlough or working from home, maybe people who have been sick and unable to be present in the workplace, we know that the engagement and risk assessments that need to be done when a deviation investigation is identified have not always been done on time and in a timely manner. And we know that the expectation is that you should engage and risk assess each deviation within 8 hours, within one shift. But that can be very difficult for some firms where their headcount has been hit from the COVID restrictions. And equally, we're seeing evidence that people are not able to complete their deviations within 30 days. And we all know that if an investigation is left for a period of time, the review of the evidence, the conversations, the review of the batch records, the trail actually begins to go cold, and the investigation becomes much more difficult if it's delayed in some way, certainly by weeks, and absolutely if it's delayed by months. We also see as well that your percentage completion statistics for CAPA, making sure your CAPA is completed according to the target completion date, have also been impacted because of the availability of equipment, engineering, technical staff, staff available to actually complete the CAPA or indeed update the procedures. So we're anticipating some risks in those areas, and also in qualification and validation, in annual product review, change control, even in terms of the ongoing vendor appraisal system. We're anticipating that some firms have been able to make some very difficult value judgments on what to actually resource completely and what to park during these, unprecedented times. So we would ask you, of all of these types of processes and procedures within your quality system, which of them are mandated as time-bound? Which of them have you been able to complete on time? Where have you made deferrals? Have you been able to keep up with your internal and external audit system? Have you been able to keep up with your PPM, your corrective maintenance and calibration system? And where there's any defaults against these scheduled completions, how have you done the risk assessment, and how would you justify those decisions? And ultimately, what effect may that have had on the quality of your products? And of course, there may well be other backlogs that have just not been able to be managed effectively during this unprecedented time. So where does that lead us? It leads us to value judgments, doesn't it? It leads us to decisions that sometimes you wouldn't have made pre-pandemic. If you'd have had the resources, if you'd have had the availability of components or new facilities, you wouldn't need to make those decisions, but you've been pushed into making some tough compromises that you wouldn't usually contemplate. Oftentimes we're seeing an awful lot of movement between disciplines within an organization, where you're moving resources around to actually try and resolve issues. Engineers moving into QA, QC moving into QA, production staff being moved into engineering. Essentially what you're trying to do is make the best value judgment, but you're actually robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're using resources, sometimes inadequate resources or inexperienced resources, to try and do the very best you can in a very difficult situation. We understand that, your clients understand that, and the regulators will understand that, but they'll want to know how you made the decisions, what basis did you make those decisions on, how did you do your risk assessments, how will you put yourself back into control, and at what speed can you get back to the place where you were before, when you had a very sustainable, predictable quality management system. Because ultimately, where we are just now, what we're seeing with many of our clients is some subjective decisions have caused a lot of stress within the system. And of course, all of those things lead to potential GMP deficiencies and indeed in the worst case scenario, product quality risks. So this is a very serious place we're at just now. Now, many times these types of issues will follow a typical life cycle, and the very first stage in any remediation life cycle is discovery. So the first question we often ask ourselves is, are we actually good at finding the issues in the first place? Are we open to new discoveries? Or have we put our blinkers on? Have we actually stopped looking beyond and broader during this very tough period? So we have to be sure, first of all, the discovery of GMP issues is really good, really acute and very disciplined. And I'm thinking here obviously in terms of shop floor QA, internal external audit, your management review process, and of course your annual product reviews. So once you've actually found a GMP deficiency that's existing, oftentimes we have a degree of disbelief. We have a degree of denial. We have a degree of anger. You know, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Who's responsible? I can't believe this happened. You know, oftentimes all of the things that we held our reputation against are challenged during such unprecedented times as the pandemic. And there can be a period of time in the recovery process where we are struck by this degree of disbelief and denial and anger. Once you've worked through that, oftentimes there's a further degree of disbelief that sort of manifests itself as stasis, i.e. nothing really happens. We don't know what to do. We don't know which way north is. We don't know where to put our priorities. We're not quite sure where our valuable resources should be put. And that's a really dangerous time, because it's often, during these first three stages, it's oftentimes you can move backwards and forwards between discovery, disbelief and stasis many times before you get to actually accepting that there is a significant issue to deal with. Once you've accepted that issue and you've started to evaluate it, you've started to measure it, you've started to define it fully and understand the root causes, and you've started to see how that's affecting your product quality or your compliance status in your facility, providing you do a very detailed evaluation that is brutally realistic, brutally honest, and incredibly disciplined and detailed, you can then confidently move into planning, execution of actions, resolving issues, and then verifying that those issues are fixed for the long term. So just be very careful that you don't jump too quickly from discovery into execution without going through these key stages, particularly evaluation, because you don't want to be busy fools while you do CAPA that isn't actually resolving the problems that you're seeing. So be aware of the steps, help you and yourself and your teams to move through these steps as quickly as possible, but also in a detailed way, so that ultimately your evaluation step finds the true root causes of the issue that then allow you to define the best possible CAPA. So Maxine, just moving on to our pie chart here. Over to you, please.
Yes. So this was an informal poll conducted, and the key takeaway is how you get back to normal post-COVID. Has your quality system taken a back seat to the pandemic? And understandably, it probably has. So how do you reset? How do you come back quickly without reducing quality and risking compliance? Have your internal audits been continuing throughout? If not, have you considered a third-party gap assessment that will importantly identify areas of weaknesses and strengths? It will be the baseline for coming back, supporting the continuous improvement, and helping you focus on the critical items. It is very important to evaluate and make sure that the necessary steps are taken so that your teams can get back to work, the highest quality is maintained, and by doing so, you will be in compliance. So what are the 6 critical steps to getting back into control? Are you feeling a little out of control and not sure you're in control? COVID has disrupted the entire world. So what are the top 6 critical steps to getting back into control? First of all, we cannot be ostriches with our heads buried in the sand. It's been a tough year, and it's still not over. But recognize that we need to own our systems and be accountable for them. Second, we need to be realistic with what can be done in a short amount of time. We need to ask ourselves, do we have enough personnel with the right experience or expertise to get the job done? Or should we consider additional resources for the short term to get us to a point where our existing staff can carry on? Third, do you know where your gaps are? Do you understand the criticality of the gap? Every action should be based on a gap that can be supported by evidence. Do not take a shotgun approach to corrective action, but evaluate. Make sure that you are taking the appropriate methodology or appropriate action based on risk. And don't forget to take a holistic systemic view. Fourth, evaluate the gap based on the product adulteration potential. Is it because of a gap? Could the product be misbranded? Do I have a data integrity issue? Do I have failures? These would all be considered a critical risk, and your focus should be laser sharp on these. Fifth and sixth, establish a team of champions to lead this effort. Have them establish a project charter to get the team focused and organized, identify key metrics and goals, develop effectiveness checks that truly are effective, define your roles and responsibilities, and most important, define an escalation process. Don't forget reporting and frequency to your sponsor. So what are the likely hot topics? So what you're looking at right now is a 6-system quality model. So when evaluating the health of the quality system, it is important to look not only vertically, which is the instinct to do, but also to look horizontally across all the systems. So it's not each system in their own silo, but they all are intertwined, they all interlink with each other. And that's really a key takeaway message. So what are the hot topics for materials control? So let's look at this. Do you have any materials that may have expired? Do you have single source suppliers? Consider putting together a business continuity plan that identifies all critical suppliers. And what is the plan when the next pandemic or the next big event occurs? Will you be prepared? Remember, your filings will dictate what you can do, so always consider what has been filed to the regulatory agency before you make any changes. Remember that any changes may require additional testing and qualification, and it may require an additional regulatory filing. So there are many things to consider as part of material control. So let's go to manufacturing control. Have you been operating with minimal staff or resources? A lot of companies have. They've had to. They've had to shift. They've had to shut down operations. They've had staff working remotely, or they've had to lay off or furlough staff temporarily. So if that has occurred in your facility, you may need to provide additional training to your staff to avoid many issues such as deviations that may be caused by human error or data integrity situations that may be occurring because staff is coming back or you have new staff in place. Do you need to consider media fills prior to restarting full production? Is your facility in a state of control? Are you fully resourced to support your operations? I've seen instances where new equipment purchase being delayed because of borders being closed. So what can you do to mitigate? These are all items, and there are more that should be considered as part of your manufacturing controls. Packaging and labeling control. Have you been able to secure labels from your suppliers? Do they meet the pre-pandemic requirements, or have you noticed the quality of your labeling is maybe not up to par? Do you have enough resources for inspection, to conduct line clearance? Do you need additional resources? And if so, what's your on-the-job training, refresher training look like? So these, again, are other things that need to be considered. Facilities and equipment, and the ever-important utilities. So is your facility starting to show its age? Has it been a little neglected because of the pandemic? Have your utilities been maintained to pre-pandemic requirements? If not, do you need to sanitize your systems and increase testing to ensure the quality meets your requirements? Has the cleaning of the facility been maintained throughout? Or have you had lapses during this pandemic condition? If so, you may need to increase the verification of your cleaning, or you may need to do something additional as you bring your facility back up to full production. There are obviously many things to consider as you come back up. Laboratory controls or quality control. Do you have a robust data review process in place that's proceduralized? This is not a paper exercise, but one where your reviewers will actually evaluate the audit trails, the test injections, etc. They will evaluate for data integrity controls and to determine if there have been any breaches or lapses in control, if there have been any full investigations that should be conducted, or possibly interim measures and controls should be implemented until fully mitigated. Are you seeing more out of specification test results and investigations? Are the root causes pointing to analyst error? If so, retraining of laboratory personnel should be considered, especially if the facility operations have been slowed because of the pandemic. Have analysts left? Do you have enough to support testing at full scale? Again, these are all things to watch for. And again, as part of this, you should be able to watch for unintentional data integrity issues that may occur during your coming back into control. Quality management. Have internal audits ceased due to the pandemic? If so, what is the plan to bring them back? Are there sufficient QA resources for oversight on the manufacturing floor? Is there a backlog of deviations and change controls? Are you, and this is really important, are you regulatory ready? It's been probably quite some time since most of you have been inspected. Are you ready for the regulatory agency on-site visit? Is your staff prepared? Is the site prepared? These should be practiced and considered as the world starts to open up again. A pandemic cannot be the excuse for not being ready.
So thank you, Maxine. Let's move on now to dealing with difficult questions. Maxine touched on the fact that many of us in industry are going to have to grapple with some tough decisions that were made over the last year, the last 2 years, which, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, you may feel a little uncomfortable about. You may even find some of your colleagues are using this term post-event rationalization to try and underestimate the importance or significance of an issue, to try and downplay the issue or allow it somehow to be kicked in the grass. Let's be absolutely clear here. There's going to be nothing that's allowed to be kicked in the grass. The pandemic is not going to be a reason for GMP deficiencies. And we've got to be prepared to face down and look at those key issues that we've had to deal with and present why we felt that that was a reasonable and justified place to go back then. So let's make sure we don't hide these issues in the shadows. Let's be sure that everybody's aware of them, that they're drilled on the importance of them, they're drilled on the background to them, and of course the scientific data that shows the level of risk with each issue. So when you've identified these risks or these difficult decisions you've made, you can assess them using ICHQ9 quality risk management and calculate the risk probability number. And of course, many of you will know that this is made up of a scoring system that takes into account the severity of the issue, the occurrence or frequency that the issue would have occurred, and also the degree of detectability of the issue. So if it's a very severe issue that occurs frequently, that is difficult to verify or to predict, that would obviously be a high risk issue for you to deal with. And you can use RPN as a way of ranking those priorities and addressing those issues by order of priority. Once you start looking at those priorities, it's easy then to take the time with your subject matter experts, looking at your data, your batch records, your reports, to really work out what the potential root causes of those issues were. You know, why did it happen? Who was involved? When did it start? When did it finish? What effect has it had on product quality, adulteration or misbranding of the product? What kind of systemic issues may have been caused here? And is there an element perhaps of human error or poor decision making that have occurred during this as well? But ultimately, you've got to treat each issue as a really good opportunity to learn or gain a deeper understanding of your system and people and their behaviours. And you've got to use each issue as a way of driving down the severity of recurrence, the frequency of a recurrence, and also to try and drive away any ambiguity or unpredictability. So you're actually being given a gift in a way with these issues. You should try to grasp them in such a way that you learn something and you strengthen the system on the back of it. So once you've understood the root cause analysis and you've understood what CAPA may be needed, you then are going to have to present the CAPA that you've put in place. That CAPA may be work in progress. It may not be completed at the time of your next regulatory inspection. It may be somewhat compromised by the available resources. So you want to be able to put together a playbook or an easy route map so that you can justify how you dealt with that difficult issue. And these difficult issues or most feared questions are absolutely 100% going to come up during your inspection. And the more you can prepare for them and understand them, the better you will come across during the inspection in terms of professionalism and also dedicating yourself to compliance to the GMPs. So we all know that ultimately, if you can acknowledge an issue, you can accept it and own it, and if you can take the time to define it well, you've got a great chance of actually fixing it. And you've got to make sure you really understand the top and bottom of each issue in turn. You know, I think it was Einstein that said that if he was given an hour to fix an issue, he would take 45 minutes to define it and just leave 15 minutes to fix it. So if you define it well, you're going to get to the right root cause, the right CAPA, and fix it for good. There's no substitute at all for referring to the cGMPs. You've got to know what the expectations are. You've got to know what's in the Code of Federal Regulations. You've got to know what ICH requires you to do. You've got to know what PICS requires you to do. So there's no substitute for taking the time to go back to the GMP references and use those as your true north in any decisions. Within that playbook, you want to be able to summarize your current procedure or the context of the issue, what led to that particular issue. You want to present the performance of that system at the time. And of course, without giving a politician's answer, you've got to be able to emphasize the positive, but also embrace that there were risks as well. So nothing's perfect, but it's important to make sure that any reviewer sees both the risks in a glorious technicolor, but also understands the things that were in control, that were under good design, good testing or good monitoring to confirm that the product still remained in compliance and of the right quality. And we're going to talk a little bit about those types of product quality risk assessments in the next slide when we talk about chain of risk. And then, of course, within the playbook, you want to summarize your planned improvements. What am I going to do to correct, to provide corrective action, to provide preventive action, and to provide effectiveness checks of each individual action? And they, of course, have to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, target-orientated actions, so that it's easy for anyone to see the route map that you're going through to get yourself back into compliance. And as Maxine said, it's a great idea to have your subject matter experts complete a project charter so that everyone can see the part they play and the deliverables that are expected from them at whatever target completion date they're expected. So the key tip here, and I'll say this twice because it is really that important, is in all of these playbooks, don't try to defend the indefendable. You know, ultimately, if you put a lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. So there is no point in trying to make it look much, much better than it is, when ultimately any regulator, client or colleague can really see the weaknesses in the argument. So, you know, don't try to defend bad practice. It's time now to put those things right rather than defend the past. So let's think a little bit about this chain of risk. And I've often used this myself in my role as a qualified person trainer. And ultimately, when you think of risks to our industry, the first and most important risk that we consider is product adulteration. How do we know that the primary, secondary and tertiary structure of that molecule, that medicinal product, is what it should be? How do we know it's free from adulteration, free from chemicals, free from viruses, free from microbes, whatever critical quality attributes that particular dosage form should have? And of course, when we think about adulteration, patient risk is always going to be the number one priority. The second part of the chain is product misbranding. So product misbranding is when you say a product is something and it clearly isn't. So if you say that you followed a particular procedure, a laboratory method, a calibration method, and you didn't follow it, then what you purported to do, what your intentions were not what you actually did. So the product is in effect misbranded. And again, regarding any type of deficiency on that type, you want to be sure that patient risk, again, is the first priority. The third part of the chain is more perhaps to do with compliance to your commitments. You're making a legal commitment when you submit a product license or any submission to regulatory agencies. You're making a commitment if you claim compliance to any compendial reference, and you're making a commitment to your clients when you say in your quality technical agreement that you're going to do something in a certain way. And indeed, if you make any regulatory commitment, if you default against that, essentially you're supplying something that was not done as intended. And then ultimately, the final risk is just a clear deficiency against the reference within GMP. So it's important when you do your root cause analysis of the risks that you've had during the pandemic that you work out very clearly, with great scientific justification, using science, compliance and knowledge of your product as to whether the product is adulterated, the product is misbranded, whether deficiencies against commitments have been made, or whether there are GMP deficiencies against the references, and to understand how they've impacted your product and the organisation as a whole. So regardless, each risk has to be well defined, unambiguous. You need to know when it started, when it ended, what impact it had on past batches, what impact it has on today's batches, and indeed what impact it may have on future batches if you can't complete the actions to prevent recurrence immediately. And then ultimately, as part of your playbook, looking at the chain of risk, you want to be able to explain very carefully what you're doing in terms of CAPA. So corrections, corrective actions, and preventive actions linked in with your effectiveness checks. So this is really crucial. Once you've got that playbook, and once you've got sight of what that GMP deficiency is, never forget to come back to the GMP references and be sure that you're meeting the minimum requirements. Always double check and do a 360-degree review to be sure that you've defined the product in full and you've got the correct root cause. And then ultimately you can then start to put together CAPA that is going to prevent recurrence, that is credible and authentic and likely to be successful. Now, ultimately, whether you're making a regulatory response after an inspection, or indeed whether you are looking to structure a CAPA of a serious or systemic issue, there are some key tips here that help you put that response together so that your response is complete, it's believable, that people can acknowledge that you've fully understood the observation, you've fully understood the options available to you, you've fully understood the impact on the product, and you've derived CAPA, which is likely to be successful. So what we're showing on this table is some tips on how to write these responses and what to consider when you generate CAPA. So the first thing is to acknowledge the issue, to own the issue. But you can only acknowledge and own the issue if it is a fair reflection of reality. So always double and triple check that the observation is true, is actually happened or did happen. And look for evidence that it did actually happen in the way that you thought it happened. You can then look to see whether that problem has relatives, whether it has related issues that have occurred elsewhere on the site, so that you can resolve not just the specific issue, but also any related systemic precautions that you take that really didn't prevent that occurring. So look horizontally, as Maxine said, not just vertically. A key issue for everybody, and certainly the EU qualified persons, is to know exactly when the issue started, what batches it affected, and how it ended, or indeed is it still going on, so that you in effect bracket the issue. You know when it started, when it ended, and all of the batches that potentially could be impacted by that issue. Of course, then you detail your root causes. You do your product impact assessment, not just on product that will be made in the future, but also work in progress and also batches that are on the market. You record exactly how you corrected the issue, what you'll do to stop the issue recurring, how you'll prevent the issue from a systemic point of view, any interim actions, and then, of course, the all-important CAPA effectiveness check. Actually measuring that your RPN number, your severity, occurrence, and detectability score has been reduced by the CAPA that you put in place. So what I'm going to ask Maxine to go through now is a really interesting case study that brings a lot of these key tips together into one set of slides. So I'll hand over to Maxine now. Thank you, Maxine.
Thanks, John. So as a result, so we were asked to come in and do a corporate-wide assessment of a company's quality system. And we identified a number of gaps, including the CAPA system. And what we found is that there was thousands of deviations yearly, of which, when talking with staff and management, they actually thought that this was normal and to be expected until the gap assessment. And then what we were able to do is not only demonstrate that this is not normal, but also a process to kind of bring them back to what would be considered a normal or much better process. And through doing this, we were able to establish what the cost actually was of this poor quality. So I'm going to walk you through this scenario. So one of the things, the outcomes of the gap assessment was that the investigations were inadequate, the scope was not usually defined, and did not explore whether other batches or processes or products or other sites were potentially affected. And there was a number of sites involved. And they all did the same processes, so there should have been some linkages. Risk assessments were inconsistent or they were not done at all. And they didn't really get down to, is there a patient risk? There was no formal system to escalate nonconformances into the CAPA system. And likewise, root cause analysis were either weak or everything was human error or operator error. Corrective actions were frequently limited to retraining. So, certainly if the operator made an error, we're going to retrain the operator. But that wasn't really what happened. And then there was no effectiveness checks. Okay, so the objective was really to, once we identified the situation to management, the objective was really to, how are we going to do this? So we actually proposed training over 300 staff members to include their investigators, reviewers, and approvers across their network. We actually conducted formal third-party reviews of completed investigation reports. So we actually evaluated those reports. We provided the critique of those investigation reports. We helped them identify root cause and what the risks were. And through doing this, we were able to mentor and coach investigators with feedback from a number of these third-party reviews that we conducted for them on their behalf. As part of this, we developed a training course that included root cause analysis. We limited the training to about 15 attendees at a time to maximize teamwork and interaction with the instructors. So it was a really interactive and very focused on teaching and coaching and mentoring individuals on how to actually conduct a root cause analysis. We developed a formal scoring process that included a rubric with which we focused on 6 primary areas, such as the problem statement. So again, as John said earlier, it really is important that you define what the issue is first. Spend the time really understanding what exactly happened. Once you've done that, then you can develop a risk assessment, determine what the root cause is or what the root causes are. You can analyze the data and then really develop a very good corrective and preventive action with effectiveness checks. And those are really the 6 steps to really making sure that you've got a good investigation process in place. And then as part of the process, we would provide the coaching and mentoring. And then eventually we would certify the investigators, and they had their own investigation team, through submission of their investigation reports. And it was really interesting what we found. Okay, so now we're going to talk about outcomes and benefits to the client. Really what was the return on investment? Because they spent, they had us come in and they had us do the gap assessment. But the return was that they were able to develop a formal objective risk-based assessment process. They now were able to escalate based on risk, any deviations or nonconformances. The investigators had a number of new tools that really helped support identification of root causes and really helped them identify effective corrective actions. We had trained over 300 investigators at one point, and we had reviewed over 120 investigations. And what we found is that through the coaching and mentoring and training is that the quality of the investigation significantly improved over time. And it was significant enough to where we were able to statistically quantify, what was working and what wasn't working. And we were able to get a 95% confidence on the improvements in the investigation process. In addition, with the strengthened systems in place, the regulatory risks by default automatically went way down too. So I'm a big proponent, if you have good quality in place, your compliance, you should always be in compliance, and it should just be a natural effect. With the improved identification of root causes and the implementation of the corrective actions, the frequency of the nonconformances or deviations went from about 40,000 per year to under 20,000. So they were able to reduce in a very short period of time the number of events that were occurring because they implemented the right corrective actions and they put the right corrective actions in place. And we were able to, at that time, determine the benefit to them of the improvement through a cost of quality analysis. And what they did is at that time, and now it's even much greater, is they were to benefit by over $3 million to date. So it was a huge, it was a huge effort on their part. The benefit was clearly, we were able to clearly measure the benefit of putting into place a good investigation process, a good root cause, a good risk assessment. So those were all things realized through this exercise or through this case study. And one of the things is as they continue to move forward, the benefits would continue to accrue, and they would know how to manage new deviations and new non-conformances going forward. So in summary, life is going to change. It does all the time, and we just have to be prepared. Certainly, I don't think anybody was prepared for the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, nobody ever expected what had happened to happen. I think today we all know that it will likely happen again or some other critical event will occur. So we just have to be prepared. Priorities will always change. We go from, one day this might be a critical priority, the next day something else will be. So we have to be able to always adapt and adjust accordingly. This is important. Keep your eyes on the big items, the critical items, the things that might affect product adulteration, product misbranding, or anything that might put a patient at risk. Those are the things that you really need to keep your eyes on. Again, be prepared to pivot and manage your resources accordingly. Again, the one thing that, and this is the one thing that regulatory agencies are starting to ask for, is business continuity plans. I highly encourage that you think about that and that you be prepared for the next pandemic or the next big disruption that will occur. And then what we've done here, John and I have included, some additional information to NSF's website that might provide and give you better information, whether it be a white paper or a video from John or myself, or further case studies that you might be interested in. So, John, any final closing comments?
Well, I've really enjoyed working with you again on this webinar today, Maxine, and I guess it's just for us now to say goodbye to everybody, and we'll get back to working on GMP remediation programs all over the world, won't we?
Yes, we will. And again, John, thank you. It's been a pleasure.